Amazing. Let's get started. So hello to all of our delegates who are joining on Zoom and our public viewers and some delegates joining on our YouTube live stream. And welcome to our third panel discussion of the weekend. Here we're going to be talking about education ministers taking climate action. And we really hope that everyone is enjoying the Mock Education Ministers Summit so far. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you of a couple of bits of important information. So just a reminder that we have live interpretation this weekend. So this session is going to be held in English. So if you need interpretation into French or Spanish, please follow the guidelines on the screen. Please join an interpretation channel by clicking on the interpretation mode and choosing the language you would like to hear. For better sound quality, please mute the original audio. Speakers, including myself, please remember to speak slowly and clearly and avoid regional vocabulary, acronyms and jargon where possible. Thank you so much to our team of volunteer interpreters supported by Common Languages. Please be really patient and share compassion with them. We have a team available for technical support throughout the event, so please do send a message via the chat box or the delegate WhatsApp group if you need assistance. Those who are providing this support will have technical support or tech in their Zoom name. So I'll just give everyone a minute to get sorted with that interpretation and make sure everyone's on the right language channel. Okay, amazing. Maybe we can get started. Wonderful. I think everyone's sorted. Amazing. So in this session, we're really honoured to welcome former Italian Minister of Education, Lorenzo Fioramonti, to discuss climate action through education and the really important role education ministers can play in realising quality climate education globally. Following the Mock Education Ministers Summit, our aim is to take our unified youth definition and asks for quality climate education to education ministers in all of our home countries and really push them to commit to bold and ambitious climate education commitments ahead of COP28. With that in mind, it's so valuable to be able to hear from a former education minister who took climate education so seriously during their time in office and made real change, which we're really hoping we can encourage other education ministers to follow. My name's Rosie Latchford and I'm a campaign manager for education at SOS UK, where I support the brilliant young people of the Mock COP campaign that have brought us here today. I'm really delighted to be facilitating this conversation today with Professor Lorenzo Fioramonti, the founding director of the Institute for Sustainability at the University of Surrey in the UK, and former Member of Parliament and Minister of Education, University and Research in Italy. Lorenzo was responsible for spearheading the policy that made Italy the first country in the world where the study of climate change and sustainable development was mandatory for all students, which I think is a really amazing achievement. So for the next hour, we're really delighted to be speaking with Lorenzo about his time as an education minister, the influence education ministers can have, and how, as young people, we can work most effectively with them. We'll then go into a question and answer session. First, some pre-submitted questions from delegates, and then we have the chance to open up to a wider discussion, taking some open questions from the audience. If you have a question, please feel free to put this in the chat box during any point of the conversation, and we will come to them during the Q&A at the end. So to start hearing from you, Lorenzo, and all of your experiences, to start with, please could you tell us about your time as a Minister of Education and what you set out to achieve on climate education reforms in Italy?
Well, first of all, thank you for having invited me to this Mock Education Ministers Summit. I think it's a great initiative. I'm sure you guys are having interesting conversations, and so I want to congratulate you on doing this. And my experience as a Minister of Education was quite challenging, I must admit. I was thrown into the political arena without major preparation. I was an academic, and within a matter of weeks, I was elevated to government. So my ambition was to ensure that climate change was taken seriously by society. And no one had ever considered the potential impact of education reform. Often the Ministry of Education is considered a minor portfolio, right? Ambitious politicians try to, they aim for finance, for labor, for industry, and so on and so forth, for business. And then on the contrary, I thought that actually the education minister could have a lot of impact. Consider we have in Italy over 8 million students going to school, like without considering university students, and there are over 1.5 million at the university level. So roughly 10 million people listen to the education minister every day. I don't think there's any other role in government that has that kind of impact. And at the same time, there was this clear call. At that time, remember, it was the beginning of the climate strikes. So we had in March, it was back in 2018. So we had in March the first global demonstration, the first strike, and then we had another one in September. And I really listened to what students all over the world were saying, and it was a very simple message. They were saying, "What's the point of going to school if we're not dealing with the biggest challenge we've ever faced as a species, right?" And so to me, that was really, really crucial. What's the point of going to school if that's not where you are getting the kind of information, you're not building the skills you need in order to deal with an existential threat? I mean, basically, you're wasting your time. You shouldn't go to school. And then I thought, okay, how do we make schools relevant then? How do we also empower students all over the world? Because that was the other challenge. A lot of students were telling me, "Hey, guys, you tell us that it's going to be our job to fix the world, but how do we do that?" First of all, it should be your job because we may not have time by the time we get to any position of power. But secondly, even if we wanted to do that and if we had time, how do you fix the world? How does one fix the world? So the second part was also how to address this sort of climate anxiety that was becoming so widespread, of students feeling disempowered, the youth feeling disempowered and scared about the future. So in one single shot, we sat down and we thought, okay, how can we do something quickly? Because my bigger ambition was to change the entire school curriculum, but it takes generations, takes decades. So while I embarked on that process and never completed it, obviously, I thought, okay, how can I do something quickly that allows us at least to make a dent into the overall system and open up space for conversations around climate change and sustainability? So we decided to introduce a new subject in the school curriculum and basically turn what used to be civic education, turn it into green civic education. So making sure that studying climate change wasn't done from a purely scientific perspective. Okay, I think students somehow through geography, through science, get to discuss what's happening to our climate. But I don't think that's what they need. They needed moments where they could do something about it, right? So that's why civic education was an interesting spot, an interesting space, because it allowed them to get practical and say, okay, now we know what's going on with our climate, with our environment, but what can we do? Can we come up with projects to try and make it change, make a difference? So the green civic education we developed was all practical, was a possibility for students all over the world to be active and empowered in trying to address the problem. And I think this is what is needed. It's not need more scientific conversations. That's perfectly fine. And I think schools do that by and large. But I think what is needed is a practical, experiential space where students can actually feel they're doing something. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think it's like, the work that all of the young people here today have done in developing this youth statement of what quality climate education is really recognizes like the depth and the different levels that climate education can work to create change, both in understanding and creating the solutions, but also combating climate anxiety. So it's super interesting to hear you share that and really inspiring to hear about the work that you did manage to push through. So I know a key part of your achievements during your time in office were also through influencing on that international stage. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about how you work to platform climate education internationally, for example, at COP26, and what progress was made there.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, after we made an announcement And so technically, we had to introduce a new law. It took about a year to do so. We got a bipartisan majority, by the way. So my law was voted unanimously by majority and minority in opposition. Okay, so this is quite crucial because we managed to design it in a way that everyone understood how important that was. We got that invited to go to Madrid for COP. That was December 2019, and that was the big topic there. So it was really the same time humbling and inspiring to think that an education minister could be one of the key speakers at a climate conference. I don't think that's ever happened. So, there were all these climate experts and, like climate delegates and climate representatives and ministers of the environment and so on and so forth. And then there was one minister of education that actually spoke to the assembly. And I thought that was really powerful. And I think many of them realized that no matter what you do in terms of reducing the emissions, which is quite insufficient, as we know, you cannot really achieve any long-term objectives unless you change the culture. And you can only change the culture through education, consumption behavior, consumption choices. We have done an international study showing that if you, through climate education, through quality climate education, you can empower youth around the world and have a direct impact on reducing carbon emissions, because the youth are not going to simply wait until they become adults to do something. As youth, they're children. They're members of families. They affect the choices of their own families. They affect the choices of their own communities. They get active right away. So we realized that climate change education was going to have an impact immediately, not only in the medium to long term, which is what usually people say, that education only has an impact later on. We realized that actually it was working beautifully, even immediately. And it had a massive impact, even compared to the rollout of wind turbines and solar panels and all of that. So it was very cheap. It doesn't cost anything, believe it or not. It doesn't require big infrastructure. It's something you can do via millions and millions of schools tomorrow and have an impact right away. And so we tried to communicate internationally that if countries were serious about this, were serious about the Paris Agreement, were serious about respecting their own commitments, they should have done this from the get-go. They should have done this as a priority because it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't make anyone unhappy. You're not going to have people out there in society protesting because they don't want a new, wind turbine installation, or you're not going to have someone opposing it for any specific reason. It's actually something that can be bipartisan, can be supported by everyone, have a major impact. So our main argument was, if you're serious about it, you should do this from the very beginning. This is the most powerful way to change people's cultures and perceptions, to build a culture of climate sensitivity, of environmental respect, to turn society into that beautiful, beautiful substrate of people that you would expect to be able to take care of the planet. And, because so far we've been told that we don't have to take care of the planet. Our cultural models do exactly the opposite. And by doing so, in a very, very simple way, you can have massive impact and long-lasting one.
Yeah, that's really, really lovely to hear, and so true. I think, the way that we understand quality climate education at COP is definitely that, supporting and equipping young people in the now to take climate action, like through some of our grassroots campaigns, like Teach the Teacher, Teach the Politician, to bring that young person's perspective on what it means to be a young person in the climate crisis to the forefront of these decision makers. And yeah, it's a really lovely thought that, climate education is that tool to build that sustainable and just future. And I think that's a really lovely reflection from you there. So for the last question from me, in our Unified Youth Statement, we're calling for ministers of education to really consistently engage with young people in the design, implementation, and evaluation of climate education strategies. So could you tell us a little bit about how you worked with young people during your time in office?
As soon as I started, I thought that I wanted the Ministry of Education to become really the Ministry of the Youth. If you think about it, that's 90% of what the youth, do, right? They go to school. That's the world, right? So I thought if there is one ministry that should represent them and should give them voice, that should be the Ministry of Education. So we set up all sorts of, official meetings and gatherings and forums where the youth could come from different angles, from the little children of primary school. Okay, so if you were to come to the ministry when I was in power, when I was in charge, you would have seen kids running around all the time. We would have schools visiting all the time, taking over some sections. We would have the youth proposing ideas, proposing reforms, and then discussing them. When we had the September 2019 climate strike, I think the 15th of September, I can't remember. I was the first minister in history, I think, that wrote an open letter to all schools to allow kids now to go to school on that day. I said very clearly, and this was after I received a bunch of letters from students saying to me, please, can you tell our schools that this is not, we're not going to school because we don't want to study. We want to go and take to the streets because this is an important experience for us. It's a sign of maturity. And so I wrote this letter to all schools, 54,000 schools. I wrote a letter to say, here's the minister talking to you. The youth want to go take to the streets, go out there and take one day off to try and save the planet, to build a future for themselves. This is not skipping school. This is actually deepening the meaning of what the school community is. They're going to get together with their teachers. It's going to be beautiful. Beautiful. It's going to be it's a beautiful experience. And I said, and I titled that letter, the most important lesson of their life. That this was actually, they should have encouraged the students not to go to school on that day and to take to the streets and get together. So I wrote this letter, and that really supported the participation in the strike. I think we had millions of youth all over Italy doing that. And there were tens of thousands of schools that adopted the policy I had encouraged. So it was really, I think it was really an idea that the ministry should be the place where the youth could get together, and should become the loudspeaker of the younger generations, and empowering schools to become these spaces of democratic participation, like spaces where the youth could come together, and while they were studying and doing all the important things you do at school, they were also given an opportunity to really embrace the idea of civic participation and turning that into a fundamental lesson in becoming active citizens.
Yeah, that's so amazing to hear. And I think, what you were describing about how you engage with youth is like such meaningful youth participation and youth voice that would be so amazing if that could be incorporated across the board. And I think, yeah, the youth climate strikes and Fridays for the Future really shows the power and everything that's come on for that, the power of youth climate justice movements, and everything they can achieve. So yeah, it's not to be undervalued, I suppose. So yeah, thank you so much for that really, really lovely reflection. So now we're going to move on to some pre-submitted questions from delegates. So these have been submitted from the delegates to the Mock Education Ministers Summit in advance. And then just after that, we're going to be opening the floor to live questions from delegates. So again, if anyone wants to ask Lorenzo a question, please do pop it in the chat box. So firstly, what do you think are the main challenges education ministers face when seeking to integrate climate education into their education systems? And what effective strategies could they potentially use to overcome these barriers?
Well, the most significant challenge is the resistance of schools to change their curriculum, right? So there's a sense that there is a general institutional resistance every time you propose something new. Schools tend to be quite conservative, and they would say, well, this is nice in principle, but in practice, it can't be done. So that is the initial reaction. I think a lot of ministers simply give up, and they think, okay, my gosh, this is going to take a life. I'm not going to be able to do it. So to me, my advice would be try to find a way not to expand the curriculum, but try to find a way of what kind of opening do you have in the curriculum so you can introduce some topics without having to alter the entire functioning of it? Let me be more specific. When I did it, there was no money, right? I couldn't, if I'd added another 2 hours a week to the school programs, to the curriculum, that would have meant hiring people, that would have meant more money, and there was no money. So what I did was to carve out space within the existing curriculum, stealing basically 5 minutes from geography, 5 minutes from science, 5 minutes from literature, and put it together 1 hour a week in which they could focus on climate related projects. And I couldn't hire more teachers, so I developed a system whereby the most appropriate teacher in the entire school was going to be given the task to manage this hour, this specific module. And the module was project-based, so it wouldn't require new specific skills. It could be done pretty successfully by a teacher of geography, by a teacher of science, even by a teacher of economics, depending on the kinds of schools. Of conventional teachers could do this. We developed a format and they could start applying it. So why am I saying this? Because if you think of doing this by transforming the entire curriculum on day one, you're going to fail. That should be your long-term ambition. But you can use this, I would say, smart approach to try and build consensus in schools in preparation for the long-term objective. And you can do so by carving out space for a new module within the existing curriculum and identifying coordinators that are the most suitable candidates within the existing cohort of teachers you have in schools.
Amazing. Thank you for that. It's really interesting to hear that approach. And I think as our delegates go back to campaign with their education ministers, it's interesting to hear, practical perspectives of how these sorts of things can be implemented. So for our second question from Surabi, a delegate from India, how can education ministers ensure cross-sectoral coordination with other ministries, such as health and environment, for effective climate and education-related policy and programming?
That's a major challenge. Our governments are not coordinated. Different portfolios do not necessarily synchronize with one another. Unfortunately, there is this idea that operating separately is more efficient than operating together, which is a big mistake, right? Because if you try and build efficiency, for instance, in healthcare by reducing costs, you may ultimately have a negative impact in another field, or the other way around. Think, for instance, of making the use of, introducing energy resources that are polluting, right? You may think you're adding value to the economy, but you're generating perhaps more costs for healthcare. So you are competing with your own colleagues in the different ministries and departments. So it's important that we all coordinate it. And the main argument that I keep telling everyone is that in an age of financial restrictions and financial distress, which is basically, it's been my entire life. I don't think I've ever lived in an era of abundance. Okay, so there's always been, there's no money, budgets have to be cut, and so on and so forth. Well, in an era of financial distress in public finances, investing in education has a positive impact on anything else. When people are better educated, they tend to get better jobs. They tend to get less sick. They behave more responsibly, commit fewer crimes, much less inclined to commit crimes, and so on and so forth. So basically, investing in education has positive ripple effects in everything else. And ultimately, this means reducing public expenditure. A population that doesn't get sick means that we need less money for public health care. And a population that doesn't pollute means that we need less money to clean up the mess. A population that commits less crimes means that we don't really need so much money going into, our prisons and our police and so on and so forth, correctional services in general. So investing in education is the best possible investment for everyone else. So everyone should, if I were the Minister of Finance, I would say, oh, we need to put money in education because that means better jobs, more tax for me. If I were the Minister of Healthcare, I would say, I'd like to put more money in education because better educated people means fewer sick people. And that means good thing for me because I manage healthcare and so on and so forth. It should be everyone's incentive to support education.
Yeah, it's interesting and really important to understand those interconnections, especially when it comes to climate education, right? You know, if it's going to be the thing that helps us understand and implement climate solutions, that expands across, you know, every department and every corner of society, I suppose.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks so much for that. We've got our final pre-submitted question now, which is from Bacanti, who is a delegate from the Ivory Coast. And they asked, how do we encourage international cooperation between countries with varying resources to strengthen climate education globally and create a network of support for countries seeking to advance climate education?
So this is a very good point, a very important one. And since I left my job as a minister, I've been supporting a global conversation around this. So we put together a network of organizations, and SOS UK is part of it, by the way. And the main idea was to bring together all the scientific knowledge we have around climate education and the positive impacts that it can have, bringing together the expertise to have a one-stop shop, so that if there is a minister in a country far away from Europe, I don't know, imagine a little country in the middle of the ocean that would like to adopt climate education, but may not know how to do that, could pick up the phone and say, here is the minister of Papua New Guinea or the Maldives. I'd like to do so. Can you help me? Where do I find the models, the formats? How do I get the kind of knowledge and strategic approach that makes it efficient and effective? Because that is needed, right? I mean, like we were lucky enough to be quite knowledgeable about this, but not everyone is. And we made a lot of mistakes, by the way. So we would, if I were to do it now, I would do it differently, right? So there needs to be a repository of information and also a place where any policymaker could go and find support, find know-how and expertise, and perhaps exchange best practices with other countries so that we all know how to make this as effective as possible. Also, because if you don't do it effectively and somehow it doesn't turn out to be a good idea or an effective one, what happens? That other countries may look at you and think that it's not worth it, right? So it needs to be done effectively so that we're generating a lot of interest and positive imitation.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and such an important point about collaboration, sharing resources, and supporting
Exactly.
different countries. In our Unified Youth Statement, delegates talk a lot about this idea that wealthier countries who are the most responsible for the climate crisis should provide climate finance to support building these climate resilient and strong climate education systems in other countries. I wonder if you had any reflections on that.
I think that's a general rule. I'm very supportive of, climate justice expectations and proposals. I think there is a fundamental responsibility here, historic responsibility that must be taken into account. It goes without saying, well beyond education, that is true for green finance, that is true for fair trade, and so on and so forth. I also think that, for all intents and purposes, the most responsible countries, the most responsible societies, the societies most responsible for climate change should also be the ones leading by example, or at least showing the full commitment towards building a different type of development. And that is only possible if you take climate education seriously. Otherwise, you're not going to have the skills of the future. I mean, let's face it, right? There's another element we haven't discussed here, but schools are not just irrelevant at this stage because they do not equip, they don't empower the youth to do something, but also because they don't equip them with the right skills. Going forward, the economy of the future, Rosie, will be very different from the economy of the present. And many of the youth will have studied years and years to acquire skills that may not be needed anymore. So it's a double whammy if you think about it, right? I mean, like it's a ripoff. You make me spend so much time doing something that is irrelevant while I could be doing something irrelevant at a time when we don't really have decades to waste. So if schools want to become relevant, if universities want to become relevant, they have to provide the right skills. And this is something that we need to do as well. And I haven't mentioned this, but as you said at the beginning, I wasn't just the Minister of Education, I was also the Minister of University and Research, which meant that I could also do the same at university level. So during my tenure at universities, introduced mandatory cross-cutting sustainability modules for all university students, no matter whether you study medicine or engineering or architecture or poetry and philosophy, you do embed sustainability in how you learn. And that is crucial, because sustainability is not just something that environmental scientists should worry about. Everyone must understand how their own expertise fits within the bigger picture of a sustainable society. So so this is also the concept of skills is crucial here. It's not just to protect the environment. It's not just to become more responsible citizens, but it's also to acquire the skills that may give you a chance to get a job in the future, because the skills we develop now may be completely irrelevant 10 years from now.
Yeah, I think that's so true and such an important point. And again, shows that depth of the potential and need for climate education to deliver. And I think talking about universities and incorporating sustainability really nicely lent itself to some of the work we did on our last phase of MockCop. And we ran a campaign called 1.5 Degrees, where we researched the ways in which, or the extent to which sustainability was incorporated into 5 key subjects across the world's top 20 universities. And we found that they were really lacking the ability to incorporate it into all of those topics like engineering and science, where it really needs to be, and also law and politics. So yeah, I think that's super interesting and a really important dimension of climate education. Okay, so now I would like to open the floor for questions from delegates. So delegates, please use the chat box to share any questions you would like to ask of Lorenzo. I'll just open the chat box and read them out. Okay, amazing. So we've got the first one here. What advice do you have for our delegates when trying to engage with their own education ministers following the summit?
What advice do I have? To empower education ministers, to help them understand that they are central to your country's development. A lot of them may not even know. A lot of them that may think that, as I said at the beginning, that their role is minor, more or less, to keep things the way they are. Instead, you should go out there and say, hey, Mr. Minister or Madam Minister, your job is crucial. You need to become a vocal representative, vocal advocate for this. This is going to make you more relevant vis-a-vis the rest of government. This is going to make you more relevant vis-a-vis the media and societal debate. And we're going to help you gain prominence, because we want education ministers to be prominent public representatives. We don't want them to be dormant, sidelined figures that very few people know. The Minister of Education should be one of the most visible minister in the government, should be someone that is continuously operating within the public debate. And I think a lot of politicians love that, love the idea of being in the limelight, and the youth can help that. So I'm not trying to be overly cynical here. I'm simply saying that it could be strategic to say, look, if you partner with us, the youth can become a fundamental loudspeaker for you too, for you to gain prominence and relevance in society. I would do it this way.
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight. And also just to add, if anyone from the public or delegates who are joining on our YouTube live stream want to ask a question, if you're at MockCop at Twitter, we can ask that too. Okay, so the next question that's come through from a delegate is, are there any other actors other than education ministers we as delegates should focus on engaging with in your experience?
I would say all actors are crucial. All actors are crucial. This must become a national debate, an international debate. So international organizations, UNESCO, for instance, which is the cultural agency of the UN, should be pursuing climate education as a fundamental priority. The European Union should do the same. Regional organizations should do the same. Companies should do the same. Companies should say, you know what, We want schools to deal with this because we want to use the skills that these youngsters will develop, students will develop over time in order to change the way we do business. So, approach business as well. They need to be part of this. We want a different civilization, and for different civilization to happen, we need to harness all skills, all possible skills. We need a different cultural model. And where do you get that? In school. That is going to benefit everyone else. So the business has an incentive to do this. International institutions should promote this, right, left, and center, and so on and so forth. So you should try and approach everyone else, also because national leaders, politicians tend to do better when they feel they're not going against the current. They're not swimming upstream, but they can actually jump on the bandwagon. So if they feel that there is a sense of camaraderie, there's a sense of unity that is behind this proposal, then they're going to champion it. Seldom do they spearhead something that is not supported by a vast majority in society.
Yeah, I think that's a really important reflection. And I think what we're trying to do this weekend and beyond in the advocacy work that all of our delegates are going to be doing is like raise that ambition for climate education, get it spoken about at the first education day at COP28, and hopefully create that demand and ambition to help education ministers commit to and sign on to this. Yeah. So we've got another question come through from Alina from Lebanon. And she is asking if you support the Green Schools certification programs. And I wonder if you do, you might be able to explain a little bit more about what they are, just for other delegates who may not know.
Yeah, I do support all sorts of, let's say, public and private certification programs. The Green Schools is a good one. There are several. They're all basically parts of a jigsaw right here. So there's not one single way to do this. You may not even find in your country a sympathetic minister of education. What do? You give up just because you didn't have a sympathetic minister of education now. Then you can put together schools. You start from the bottom up and you say, can we create a private initiative to see whether schools themselves can do something about how they use resources within the schools? How do they become more sustainable as infrastructure, energy use, food production and consumption, and so on and so forth? And then we're creating a certification system that says, here it is, you are doing what you can according to these principles. So we recognize that publicly. I think all these models are fundamental in general, especially when there is no political leadership. So it doesn't happen from the top down, then we make it happen from the bottom up.
Yeah, super important. Benedict has come through with another question. I don't know if you want to unmute and ask the question yourself, or I'm happy to read it out, whatever you'd prefer.
Hello. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
What should be the approach to bridge knowledge gaps between teachers whose primary expertise is not science, geography, or climate related, but need to teach climate change to some degree? Thank you.
Thank you, Benedicta. I don't think we should see climate education as yet another scientific subject. I don't think that's the point. You study climate change or climate greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth when you study science, when you study geography, when you study whatever. What we need is a space, as I said at the beginning, a space where students can come together and build on the knowledge that they have been given by different teachers and build projects around us, build activities, okay? For that, you don't really need to be a climate expert to lead an activity, to be coordinating an activity. You could be a philosopher for all intents and purposes, or a literature teacher to say, okay, guys, so you guys have learned all of this from those who tell you what the problem is, right? And we read it in books. You have your own science teacher that told you exactly what's going on. Now, that's just the background. Now, what do we do? How do we develop a project around this? For instance, a project that could be about reducing waste at school. A project that could be about producing energy in a more sustainable fashion. A project that could be about installing rooftop panels on the roof of the school, or a project that could be about sensitizing our local community about it. Okay, so imagine that this is what we do in Italy, right? That time when they come together and they do climate change education and sustainability education, they do not open books and study what's happening to the planet. They've already done that. They do that in their respective subjects. Now they get together, remove the books, and start thinking, what do we do about it? How do we start building practices that allow us to do something tangible? And that can be coordinated by a teacher of economics, a teacher of law, a teacher of literature, and so on and so forth. So I hope I'm making myself understood. This is not about adding scientific knowledge. It's about carving out a space for practice, for practical activities. The scientific knowledge you already have through conventional subjects. And if you don't have that, well, you work on it and make sure that when you study science, when you study natural systems, when you study geography, you touch upon that. But as far as I can tell, I doubt there's one country in the world in which the topic is not touched in one subject or another. What is missing is the follow-up. So now we all know that we're destroying the planet, and so what are we doing about it? And that's when climate change education gets into the picture. It's all about what we can do, not just what's happening to the planet, but what you and I can do to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. We have quite a lot more questions coming in now. Theophilus, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or I can read it out? Maybe I'll read it. Oh,
yeah, please read out.
Okay, lovely. So as a minister, what different approach do we employ to bridge the gap between influencing the education system into committing to our solution approaches in different countries? Into committing to our solution approaches in different countries.
Yeah, okay. Again, if you think about Theophilus, if you think about the Paris Agreement and the commitment that countries have made around reducing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in general, they're never going to be able to do that, provided that they even trying. In some cases, they're not even trying so wholeheartedly anyway. But let's say even if they were wholeheartedly trying to do that, they couldn't make a difference unless we were to change the entire social behavior around what we consume and how we produce. And that can only be done through education. That can only be done through education. People need to become responsible consumers. People need to become responsible business leaders. People need to become responsible citizens. So only by doing so at the education level, you can have the massive macro impact that we need in order to respect those commitments and achieve those targets. So if this is what your question is pointing towards, so there are different countries that have all committed to doing something about it. They're failing their commitments, partly because they're not serious about it, but also because those commitments can only be achieved if it's not just governments that try to make a difference, it's everyone. And the only way for me to make sure that everyone is part of the solution is by affecting our cultural systems, how we think, what we consider to be acceptable, and what we consider to be not acceptable. And this can be done by schools because they are it's the cultural fabric of our societies, right? It's created in schools. So those are the places where we build the culture of today and tomorrow.
Yeah, such an important reflection. I think we like to use the phrase like education can bring everyone with us and help engage everyone to build that sustainable world and make those like radical and systems-wide changes. So yeah, thanks for that. Okay, we have another question come through and I'm going to read out for Tabe or Tabe. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. What approach will be appropriate to bridge finance gaps in funding climate education in developing countries, since they are more focused on meeting other critical development needs like road development, etc.?
Yeah, this is a general problem that we think development is all about stuff. You know, that you think of like funding development is about funding roads, bridges. Well, I think development is all about brains, right? What is the most renewable resource that the country has? The quality of its people. So we should start talking about development cooperation, international development aid, about shaping minds, building skills, not doing stuff, not doing things, not making things, but making sure that people acquire the right skills and the right mindsets to be able to then do whatever stuff they think is necessary. So if, in a sense, if we were to build an international consensus, or at least an international advocacy campaign around the fact that the best investment strategy globally is investing in brains, investing in people, then I think this would bridge the gap between financing things rather than financing people. But I agree with you. There is a general approach that you develop a country by building things, by making stuff, rather than investing in brains. And this is a fundamental mistake. The most significant, think of the knowledge economy. Think of the future of economic development in the world. It's all about building the right skills that can lead to innovation and new ideas, and then everything else follows. But if you don't invest in these, you're never going to have a developed society. This is development, not the stuff around us.
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight. Does anyone else have any questions? We've got a little bit of time left before we move on to some closing remarks and a final question that we're going to ask Lorenzo. If anyone wants to type them into the chat box, please do. But yeah, thank you so much for being here. I think it's been a really interesting and broad discussion that I hope all of the delegates have got a lot out of. Anyone else got a question? Rupeng, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I have a question. Can everyone see me and hear me? Hi, Lorenzo. My name is Rupeng. I'm 23. I'm from the United States. I'm actually the only one from the North American in this mock summit. But so I have a question, but for a little bit of context, I took matters in my own hands, my own life, and built a climate policy learning platform. The name is Climate Ingenuity, to help myself and others learn that topic in lieu of universities not, at least from my observation, not covering enough. I've also learned a lot on just climate solution more broadly through being part of a specific nonprofit youth programming in my country, and also just networking with the right people. So now I am trying to explore options to help other young people through like more formal education means get a fair chance to learn about effective climate policy solutions as well. My question is, how can I work with university leaders such as professors, department deans, etc., to scale up coverage of this topic of climate solutions or policy in their schools, despite inherent challenges such as conflict of interest, a little precedent for it, but also in a way that complements rather than is mutually exclusive than what online platforms, not just my own, and prominent nonprofit programs already offer in the climate education and helping young people.
Yeah, I think you're Rupeng. So I think if we want to reach out to as many people as possible within the shortest period of time, we need to use all tools and technologies we can. So I think that online tools are extremely powerful in this regard. And I think if we were to have universities lead in developing the tools together with the youth, so that schools can develop their own modules if needed. So imagine that, again, there's no real political leadership here. Or political leadership takes time, it's lengthy, it's slow, and then you want to try and support it by creating bottom-up pressure that supports that. Then how do you do that? You need to galvanize society. How do you galvanize society quickly? By using all possible tools. So online campaigns can be extremely powerful. Universities can lead the way. Universities can give it some scientific credibility. Universities can say, we help schools develop the right curricula, develop the right tools. We can even send volunteers to schools. Our students, for instance, biology students, chemistry students, environmental science students could actually be sent out to schools to become coordinators of projects in schools while we wait for the state to come and, like to come to the party and support, the employment of new teachers and so on and so forth. So for instance, imagine that we could get hundreds of universities in the United States to send out, as part of their degree, send out students from the final year to schools to become coordinators and facilitators of climate education workshops in schools. Imagine what a powerful tool that could be, while you wait for the federal government to take some action. And in some cases, that may never happen. In the meantime, you're generating the possibility anyway.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Yeah, really good reflections. So thank you so much, Lorenzo, and thank you to all of our delegates for contributing and having to that really interesting and wide discussion. As we come to the end of the session, could I please ask you to close with any final reflections about what you would consider your number one piece of advice for how young people can most effectively work with their ministers of education to advance climate education? And I know we spoke about this a little bit earlier with a question from a delegate, but maybe just like in a sentence, like one takeaway piece of advice for our delegates.
I would say make them understand that this is the most critical thing for you, the most important thing for you, that you want schools to be relevant when it comes to building skills of the future and making you proactive about finding the solutions, and make them understand that getting the youth on your side is the most powerful army of game changers that any politician may ever desire to have. It kills me. It pains me to see how short-sighted many politicians are. But getting the youth on your side means getting a fundamental army of game changers that will be willing to support you. And this politically is crucial. So make them understand that you're a wonderful bunch of allies, and then politicians should be excited to work with the youth, because the youth are not just the future. The youth are the present, and they can help the entire society understand the importance of this. So I think politicians need to feel that they are supported, and there's nothing better than being supported by the youth, I think.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. What a lovely thing to close on and remember, like the power of youth to create real change and build, a sustainable, just and equitable future, both in the present and yeah, for the future and future generations. So yeah, thank you so much for that. A nice way to close. So yeah, this marks the end of the session. Thank you to everyone that's joined us, delegates on Zoom and public viewers on YouTube. And again, thank you so much, Lorenzo, for your time to be here with us today. I really hope everyone's enjoyed the discussion. And yet again, a huge thank you, Lorenzo, for your leadership in this space and for giving your time so generously here to share your thoughts and reflections with us today. So delegates, we're now going to move on to voting section 2, voting on the section of our youth statement, which is defining quality climate education. So please do stay in the main room. And for those joining online, please join us for the next panel discussion on youth action on climate education at 3 p.m. UTC and the closing ceremony at 8 p.m. UTC. And you can see all of the exciting speakers we've got lined up there on our website where you can find our programme. And please don't forget to share your thoughts and experiences at the Mock EMS on social media. Tag MockCop on Twitter and Instagram and use the hashtags